Flat Earth has long been touted as the mother of all conspiracy theories, marginalized, suppressed, and ridiculed for centuries as being an ignorant, ancient, unscientific worldview. But the facts of the matter are far from what you've been told. It is a fact, not a theory, that bodies of water always seek and find their own level, from a beaker, a bottle, or a bathtub, to a pond, lake, or an ocean. The natural physics of water and other liquids is to find and remain level. It is an unproven, unscientific theory with no observable, measurable, or repeatable evidence to claim that bodies of water can somehow bend, cling to the exterior of shapes, and show convexity upon their surface. It is a fact that the majority of Earth is covered in such level water, thus making it an unscientific theory to postulate that Earth is actually a gigantic sphere with bendy oceans curving all the way around it. It is a fact, not a theory, that the horizon always appears perfectly flat 360 degrees around the observer, regardless of altitude. All amateur balloon, rocket, plane, and drone footage show a completely flat horizon as high as we can reach, over 20 miles, or 120,000 feet up. The only time the horizon ever bends is when viewed through a fisheye lens or a curved commercial airplane window. It is also a fact that the horizon always rises to the eye level of the observer as altitude is gained, so you never have to look down to see it. If the Earth were in fact a globe, no matter how large, as you ascended, the horizon would stay fixed, and the observer would have to tilt, looking down further and further to see it. It is a fact, not a theory, that we are able to observe objects at incredibly long distances, far beyond what would be possible if Earth were a globe 25,000 miles in circumference, as we're told. For example, it is a fact that in Genoa, Italy, from just above sea level, on clear days, it is possible to see the distant islands of Elba, Gorgona, Caprea, and Corsica, 80 to 125 miles away. It is a necessary theory that the globe Earth must curve 8 inches per mile squared, if it really be a ball 25,000 miles in circumference, as we're told. But based on such a theory, these islands would all be completely hidden behind thousands of feet of curved Earth. In fact, the record-breaking longest distance zoom photograph ever taken recently showed Pic Gaspard from Pic de Finestrelles, a whopping 275 miles away, at a height of under 10,000 feet, where, based on correct curvature calculations, the entire mountain should be invisible behind several miles of curved Earth. It is an observable, testable, repeatable, scientific fact of reality that Polaris, the North Pole star, situated perfectly over the North Pole center of Earth, never moves a single inch, night after night, year after year, century after century, with all the other fixed stars remaining fixed in their relative constellations, revolving perfect circles around Polaris. It is an unobservable, unproven, unscientific theory to claim that thousands of years ago, Polaris mysteriously did move, and Thuban or other stars became the center of rotation. It is also an unobservable, unscientific theory to claim that the Earth is spinning 1,000 miles per hour around an axis, while rotating tens of thousands of miles per hour around the Sun, while the entire solar system circles hundreds of thousands of miles per hour around the Milky Way, and the Milky Way shoots millions of miles per hour more off through infinite space, when we cannot see, hear, feel, or otherwise observe or prove any such motion, and we can see clearly for ourselves Polaris never moving, and all the other stars revolving around it. Not only this, but such circular star trails around an unmoving pole star prove that it is the stars themselves moving, and not the Earth. If the Earth were truly a tilting, wobbling, spinning space ball undergoing these multiple contradictory motions through the universe, you would only see irregular, spiral-shaped star trails, and the night sky would never be the same twice. It would be impossible for constellations to exist whatsoever if Earth were truly undergoing these various theoretical motions. This is just a brief introduction to the many observable, testable, repeatable, scientific facts of our level, motionless plain Earth that have been marginalized, suppressed, and ridiculed for centuries, in favor of various unobservable, untestable, unscientific theories purporting we live on a tilting, wobbling, spinning, ball-shaped Earth. Long before the theory of gravity was a glimmer in Newton's imagination, the natural physics of density and buoyancy already perfectly explained why apples fall down. Quite simply, objects fall or rise based on their relative density to the medium surrounding them. Apples fall because they are denser than the air, while helium balloons rise because they are lighter. No gravity necessary. This is why raindrops fall down through the air, and air bubbles rise up through water. Everything seeks its relative density and rises or falls until settling accordingly. This is why a tiny pebble sinks to the bottom of the ocean, but gigantic cruise ships and aircraft carriers stay afloat on the surface, because even though a pebble is so small, its mass relative to its volume, its density, is more than water, so it sinks. And even though a cruise ship is so large, its mass relative to its volume is less than water, so it floats. If Newton's apple had landed in a puddle instead of on his head, he would have seen the apple only fell through the air because it was denser than the air, but then floated on top of the water because it was less dense than water. Have you ever noticed how it's easier to stay afloat with your lungs full of air than it is when they're empty? Submarines float on the surface when their ballast tanks are filled with air, but when the vents are opened and seawater floods in, they begin to sink as the submarine's density becomes greater than water. Depending what depth they wish to dive, sailors simply adjust the ratio of air and water in their tanks, and when ready to resurface, they blow compressed air into the tanks, forcing the seawater out, lowering the density, and thus causing them to rise back to the surface. We can also prove this fact of relative density by filling a balloon with approximately half helium and half air. Since helium is lighter than the oxygen, nitrogen, and other gases that compose the air around us, filling a balloon with just the right amount of helium to compensate for and balance out the density of the plastic results in a gravity-defying, levitating balloon at equilibrium that neither rises nor falls. How is it that gravity is so strong that it can hold all the oceans, buildings, and people stuck to the underside of the ball Earth, but so weak that it allows birds, bugs, smoke, and balloons to casually evade its grips completely? How is it that gravity holds our bodies clung to the underside of a ball Earth, but yet we can easily raise our legs and arms, walk or jump, and feel no such constant downward pulling force? How is it that gravity can cause planets to revolve elliptical orbits around a single center of attraction?
Ellipses by nature require two foci, and the force of gravitation would have to regularly increase and decrease to keep planets in constant orbit and prevent pulling them into direct collision courses. Einstein's theory of relativity and the entire heliocentric model of the universe hinge upon Newton's law of gravitation. Heliocentrists claim that the Sun is the most massive object in the heavens, more massive even than the Earth, and therefore the Earth and other planets, by law, are caught up in the Sun's gravity and forced to orbit perpetual circles and ellipses around it. They claim that gravity also somehow allows people, buildings, the oceans, and all of nature to exist on the underside of their ball Earth without falling off. Now, even if gravity did exist, why would it cause both planets to orbit the Sun and people to stick to the Earth? Gravity should either cause people to float in suspended circular orbits around the Earth, or it should cause the Earth to be pulled and crashed into the Sun. What sort of magic is gravity that it can glue people's feet to the ball Earth while causing Earth itself to revolve ellipses around the Sun? The two effects are very different, yet the same cause is attributed to both. Furthermore, this magnetic-like attraction of massive objects gravity is purported to have can be found nowhere in the natural world. There is no example in nature of a massive sphere or any other shaped object which, by virtue of its mass alone, causes smaller objects to stick to or orbit around it. There is nothing on Earth massive enough that it can be shown to cause even a dust bunny to stick to or orbit around it. Try spinning a wet tennis ball or any other spherical object with smaller things placed on its surface, and you will find that everything falls or flies off, and nothing sticks to or orbits around it. To claim the existence of a physical law without a single practical evidential example is hearsay, not science. Newton also theorized, and it is now commonly taught, that the Earth's ocean tides are caused by gravitational lunar attraction. If the Moon is only 2,160 miles in diameter, and the Earth 8,000 miles, however, using their own math and law, it follows that the Earth is 87 times more massive, and therefore the larger body should attract the smaller to it, and not the other way around. If the Earth's greater gravity is what keeps the Moon in orbit, it is impossible for the Moon's lesser gravity to supersede the Earth's gravity at Earth's sea level, where its gravitational attraction would even further out-trump the Moon's. Not to mention the velocity and path of the Moon are uniform, and should therefore exert a uniform influence on the Earth's tides, when in actuality the Earth's tides vary greatly. Furthermore, if ocean tides are caused by Moon's gravitation, how is it that lakes, ponds, and other smaller bodies of standing water remain outside the Moon's grasp, while the gigantic oceans are so affected? Heliocentrists claim the ball Earth is perpetually spinning on its axis at a mind-numbing 1,038 miles per hour, or 19 miles per second, and somehow people, animals, buildings, oceans, and other surface phenomena can stick to the underside of the spinning ball without falling or flying off. Take a ride on the Gravitron at your local amusement park, however, and notice how the faster it spins, the more you are pushed away from the center of spin, not towards it. Even if the centripetal, inward pulling force, of gravity did exist, which it does not, the centrifugal, outward pushing force, of the ball Earth's supposed 19 mile per second spin would also exist and have to be overcome, yet neither of these opposing forces have ever been shown to have any existence outside the imaginations of heliocentric scientists. Astronomers claim to have measured all the planets' distances, shapes, orbits, weights, relative positions, and times of revolution, all based on the law of gravitation, and without gravity, their entire cosmology folds under its own weight. Without gravity, people cannot stand upside down on a ball Earth. Without gravity, the Earth and planets cannot be revolving around the Sun. Without Newtonian gravitation, Einsteinian relativity, Copernican heliocentricity, and the entire Big Bang ball Earth mythos cannot exist and falls to pieces. Gravity, both metaphorically and quite literally, just does not hold any water, not as a sound theory of cosmology, and not as a law supposedly responsible for holding in the world's oceans. Light things rise up, heavy things fall down. Simply a natural property of weight and density that is very different from gravity. Gravity is a hypothetical magnetic-like force possessed by large masses, which Isaac Newton needed to help explain the heliocentric theory of the universe.
Gravity sucks, gravity pulls, gravity don't follow rules. On the spinning ball, it makes us sick. Gravity is magic. It's magic. It's magic.
Now, even if gravity did exist, why would it cause both planets to orbit the sun and people to stick to the Earth? Gravity should either cause people to float in suspended circular orbits around the Earth, or it should cause the Earth to be pulled and crashed into the sun. What sort of magic is gravity that it can glue people's feet to the ball Earth?
Gravity sucks, gravity pulls, gravity don't follow rules. On the spinning ball, it makes us stick. Gravity is magic.
Gravitation is only a subterfuge employed by Newton in his attempt to prove that the Earth revolves around the sun. And the quicker it is relegated to the tomb of all the Capulets, the better will it be for all classes of society.
Gravity sucks, gravity pulls, gravity don't follow rules. On the spinning bar, it makes us stick. Gravity, it's a con trick. It's magic. It's magic. It's magic. It's magic.
There is a popular myth taught to school children, which most adults today still believe, that people in history have traveled in perfectly straight lines, eastwards or westwards, and eventually arrived back at their starting point. It is heralded as proof of the globe Earth, and claimed that hundreds of adventurers since Magellan have completed such successful circumnavigations, but the truth is that no one in history has ever set off traveling in a perfectly straight line and returned back at their starting point. All successful circumnavigations in history, whether by sea or air, have instead followed the same pattern, which is sailing or flying the most convenient route from port to port, stopping for supplies and refueling until a complete circle has been made. Not a single sailor or aviator in history has or could travel only in the same one perfectly straight direction and magically arrive back where they began. This ridiculous lie becomes obvious when critically examined, but when taught to young children, successfully bends and warps their minds into accepting globe indoctrination. Unlike the cardinal directions on a compass rose, north, south, east, and west on Earth are not simply straight lines separated by 90 degrees. North, rather than being an upward shooting arrow, is actually a point, a center point, the center point of the entire Earth, known as the geographic North Pole, situated directly below Polaris, the North Pole star, the only motionless star in the heavens, which marks the exact northern center point of the sky. South, rather than being a downward shooting arrow, is actually every line tangent to the northern center point, or in other words, every straight line extending outwards from the North Pole heads due south. East and west, rather than being right and left facing arrows, are actually clockwise and counterclockwise circles around the pole. The sun, moon, and stars all rise in the east and set in the west, making perfect circles over and around us every day. As you can observe, they travel in a circular westward path over and around the Earth, and do not all travel in a straight leftward direction as suggested by a compass rose. Likewise, navigators since ancient times have used Polaris to guide their ships, knowing that Polaris was the heavenly North Pole, south was traveling keeping your back to Polaris, east meant traveling keeping your left shoulder 90 degrees to the pole star, and west meant traveling keeping your right shoulder 90 degrees to the pole star. All circumnavigations in history have been eastwards or westwards, and never northwards or southwards, because the latter is geographically impossible. Likewise, southern hemisphere flights from Australia to South America, or New Zealand to South Africa, for example, never fly the shortest, most direct route on a globe, which would be southwards over Antarctica. It is claimed this is because such flights would allegedly be too cold for any airplanes to handle. But the reality is the routes are geographically impossible because Antarctica is not a tiny ice continent confined to the underside of a spherical spinning ball Earth. Antarctica is actually the outer southern perimeter of our level motionless plain Earth and surrounds the other 6 continents. How far southwards Antarctica actually extends, and how it terminates, or what exists beyond it, are all unknown to and kept from the general public, however, and as a result, no completely accurate, fully functioning flat Earth map exists or could exist without the people being first allowed full, independent exploration of the Arctic, Antarctic, and everywhere else. There are, however, several maps which work as good visual aids for approximating the geography of our flat stationary Earth. The Gleason's 1892 New Standard Map of the World and Hammond's 1945 Air Age Map of the World are 2 such maps. These so-called azimuthal equidistant maps are used in practical navigation and can be found in the logos of the United Nations, World Health Organization, International Maritime Organization, and International Civil Aviation Organization. They purport these to be simply 2-dimensional representations of a spherical Earth with the North Pole at the center point, and claim these maps were made by flattening the globe. But just the opposite is true, and the globe, specifically the so-called continent of Antarctica, was made by spherizing our flat Earth and bundling the expansive outer perimeter into a cramped, oddly shaped ice continent under the ball, kept off limits by treaty from the general public. In the flat Earth model, the sun and moon spotlights are perpetually hovering over and parallel to the surface of the Earth. From our vantage point, due to the law of perspective, the day and night luminaries appear to rise up the eastern horizon, curve peaking high overhead, and then sink below the western horizon. They do not escape to the underside of the flat Earth, as one might imagine, but rather rotate concentric clockwise circles around the circumference from tropic to tropic. The appearance of rising, peaking, and setting is due to the common law of perspective, where tall objects appear high overhead when nearby, but at a distance gradually lower towards the vanishing point. Samuel Rowbotham said, "Although the sun is at all times above and parallel to the Earth's surface, he appears to ascend the firmament from morning until noon, and to descend and sink below the horizon at evening. This arises from a simple and everywhere visible law of perspective. A flock of birds, when passing over a flat or marshy country, always appears to descend as it recedes, and if the flock is extensive, the first bird appears lower or nearer to the horizon than the last. The farthest light in a row of lamps appears the lowest, although each one has the same altitude. Bearing these phenomena in mind, it will easily be seen how the sun, although always parallel to the surface of the Earth, must appear to ascend when approaching and descend after leaving the meridian or noonday position. What can be more common than the observation that, standing at one end of a long row of lamp posts, those nearest to us seem to be the highest, and those farthest away the lowest, whilst, as we move along towards the opposite end of the series, those which we approach seem to get higher, and those we are leaving behind appear to gradually become lower. It is an ordinary effect of perspective for an object to appear lower and lower as the observer goes farther and farther away from it.
Let anyone try the experiment of looking at a lighthouse, church spire, monument, gas lamp, or other elevated object from a distance of only a few yards, and notice the angle at which it is observed. On going farther away, the angle under which it is seen will diminish, and the object will appear lower and lower as the distance of the observer increases, until, at a certain point, the line of sight to the object and the apparently uprising surface of the earth upon or over which it stands will converge to the angle which constitutes the vanishing point, or the horizon, beyond which it will be invisible. Heliocentrists would have you believe the very opposite of what every human who has ever walked the earth has seen with their own eyes. It is obvious to any child and sovereign-minded adult that the sun, moon, stars, and planets, every light in the sky above, revolves around the motionless earth beneath our feet. It is also plain to see that the sun and moon are both approximately the same size and situated relatively close to earth, not 400 times divergent and millions upon millions of miles away. To abandon your senses and everyday experience in favor of such unfounded science fiction fantasies is a fallacy of appeal to authority so extreme that it leaves the brainwashed believer impotent to trust his own natural instincts and forever thereafter chained to the fantastical explanations of astronomical charlatans. In the flat Earth model, the Sun and Moon luminaries revolve around the Earth once every 24 hours for the Sun, and approximately 25 hours for the Moon, illuminating like spotlights the areas over which they pass. The Sun's annual journey from tropic to tropic, solstice to solstice, is what determines the length and character of days, nights, and seasons. This is why equatorial regions experience almost year-round summer and heat, while higher latitudes north and especially south experience more distinct seasons with harsh winters. The heliocentric model claims seasons change based on the ball Earth's alleged axial tilt and elliptical orbit around the Sun. Their flawed current model even places us closest to the Sun, 91,400,000 miles, in January, when it is actually winter, and farthest from the Sun, 94,500,000 miles, in July, when it's actually summer throughout much of the Earth. They say due to the ball Earth's tilt, different places receive different amounts of direct sunlight, and that is what produces the seasonal and temperature changes. This makes little sense, however, because if the Sun's heat travels over 90 million miles to reach the ball Earth, how could a slight tilt, a mere few thousand miles maximum, negate the Sun's 90 million mile journey, giving us simultaneous tropical summers and Antarctic winters? Thomas Winship said, "The Earth is a stretched-out structure which diverges from the central north in all directions towards the south. The equator, being midway between the north center and the southern circumference, divides the course of the Sun into north and south declination. The longest circle around the world which the Sun makes is when it has reached its greatest southern declination. Gradually going northwards, the circle is contracted. In about 3 months after the southern extremity of its path has been reached, the Sun makes a circle around the equator. Still pursuing a northerly course as it goes round and above the world, in another 3 months the greatest northern declination is reached, when the Sun again begins to go towards the south. In north latitudes, when the Sun is going north, it rises earlier each day, is higher at noon, and sets later, while in southern latitudes at the same time, the Sun as a matter of course rises later, reaches a lesser altitude at noon, and sets earlier. In northern latitudes, during the southern summer, say from September to December, the Sun rises later each day, is lower at noon, and sets earlier, while in the south he rises earlier, reaches a higher altitude at noon, and sets later each day. This movement round the Earth daily is the cause of the alternations of day and night, while his northerly and southerly courses produce the seasons. When the Sun is south of the equator, it is summer in the south and winter in the north, and vice versa. The fact of the alternation of the seasons flatly contradicts the Newtonian delusion that the Earth revolves in an orbit around the Sun. It is said that summer is caused by the Earth being nearest the Sun, and winter by its being farthest from the Sun. But if the reader will follow the argument in any textbook, he will see that according to the theory, when the Earth is nearest the Sun, there must be summer in both northern and southern latitudes, and in like manner, when it is farthest from the Sun, it must be winter all over the Earth at the same time, because the whole of the globe Earth would then be farthest from the Sun. In short, it is impossible to account for the recurrence of seasons on the assumption that the Earth is globular and that it revolves in an orbit around the Sun." Gabrielle Henriette said, "The essential feature of the year is its division into 2 equal periods of 6 months, based first on the predominating length of the days over that of the nights, and vice versa, conditions which are governed by the varying hours of sunrise and sunset, and secondly, by the either high or low height reached by the Sun in the heavens at midday. The first cycle, during which the days are longer than the nights, and the Sun reaches its culminating point of the year, extends from the spring equinox to the autumn equinox, i.e. March 21st to September 22nd, and the second cycle, during which, inversely, the duration of the nights exceeds that of the days, and the Sun descends to its lowest point of the year, extends from the autumn equinox to the spring equinox, i.e. September 23rd to March 20th. These 2 6-month periods are also characterized by an opposition of temperature. During the first cycle, which corresponds to spring and summer, the heat gradually rises and falls, while during the second cycle, which comprises autumn and winter, it is the intensity of the cold which progressively increases and decreases. If the Earth were truly a globe, the Arctic and Antarctic polar regions and areas of comparable latitude north and south of the equator should share similar conditions and characteristics such as comparable temperatures, seasonal changes, length of daylight, plant and animal life. In reality, however, the Arctic and Antarctic regions and areas of comparable latitude north and south of the equator differ greatly in many ways. Thomas Winship says, "If the Earth be the globe of popular belief, the same amount of heat and cold, summer and winter, should be experienced at the same latitudes north and south of the equator. The same number of plants and animals would be found, and the same general conditions exist. That the very opposite is the case disproves the globular assumption. The great contrasts between places at the same latitudes north and south of the equator is a strong argument against the received doctrine of the rotundity of the Earth. Antarctica is by far the coldest place on Earth, with an average annual temperature of approximately -57 degrees Fahrenheit and a record low of 135.8. The average annual temperature at the North Pole, however, is a comparatively warm 4 degrees. Throughout the year, temperatures in the Antarctic vary less than half the amount at comparable Arctic latitudes. The northern Arctic region enjoys moderately warm summers and manageable winters, whereas the southern Antarctic region never even warms enough to melt the perpetual snow and ice." Thomas Winship wrote, "This uniformity of temperature partly accounts for the great accumulation of ice which is formed, not on account of the great severity of the winter, but because there is practically no summer to melt it. In the Antarctic there is eternal winter, and snow never melts. As far north as a man has traveled, he has found reindeer and hare basking in the sun, and country brilliant with rich flora. Within the Antarctic circle, no plant is to be found. The island of Kerguelen at 49 degrees southern latitude has only 18 species of native plants that can survive its hostile climate. Compare this with the island of Iceland at 65 degrees northern latitude. 16 degrees further north of the equator than Kerguelen is south, yet Iceland is home to 870 species of native plants. On the Isle of Georgia, just 54 degrees southern latitude, the same latitude as Canada or England in the north, where dense forests of various tall trees abound, the infamous Captain Cook wrote that he was unable to find a single shrub large enough to make a toothpick. Cook wrote, "Not a tree was to be seen. The lands which lie to the south are doomed by nature to perpetual frigidness, never to feel the warmth of the sun's rays, whose horrible and savage aspect I have not words to describe. Even marine life is sparse in certain tracts of vast extent, and the sea-bird is seldom observed flying over such lonely wastes. The contrasts between the limits of organic life in Arctic and Antarctic zones is very remarkable and significant. Vegetables and land animals are found at nearly 80 degrees in the north, while from the parallel of 58 degrees in the south, the lichen and such-like plants only clothe the rocks, and seabirds and the cetaceous tribes alone are seen upon the desolate beaches. In the Arctic there are 4 clearly distinguished seasons, warm summers, and an abundance of plant and animal life, none of which can be said of the Antarctic. The Eskimo live as far north as the 79th parallel, whereas in the south no native man is found higher than the 56th. W.N.R. Chambers, in Arctic Explorations, wrote, "Beyond the 70th degree of southern latitude, not a tree meets the eye. Wearied with the white waste of snow, forests, woods, even shrubs have disappeared, and given place to a few lichens and creeping woody plants, which scantily clothe the indurated soil. Still, in the farthest north, nature claims her birthright of beauty, and in the brief and rapid summer she brings forth numerous flowers and grasses to bloom for a few days, to be again blasted by the swiftly recurring winter. The rapid fervor of an Arctic summer had already, June 1st, converted the snowy waste into luxuriant pasture ground, rich in flowers and grass, with almost the same lively appearance as that of an English meadow." In New Zealand, situated at 42 degrees southern latitude, on the winter solstice the sun rises at 4:31 a.m. and sets at 7:29 p.m., making the longest day of the year 14 hours and 58 minutes. On the summer solstice, the New Zealand sun rises at 7:29 a.m. and sets at 4:31 p.m., making the shortest day 9 hours and 2 minutes long. Meanwhile, in England, a full 10 degrees farther north of the equator than New Zealand lies south, the longest day is 16 hours and 34 minutes, the shortest day 7 hours and 45 minutes. Therefore, the longest day in New Zealand is 1 hour and 36 minutes shorter than the longest day in England, and the shortest day in New Zealand is 1 hour and 17 minutes longer than the shortest day in England. William Swainson, an Englishman who emigrated and became Attorney General of New Zealand in the mid-19th century, lived in both countries for decades and wrote of their differences, stating, "The range of temperature is limited, there being no excess of either heat or cold. Compared with the climate of England, the summer of New Zealand is but very little warmer, though considerably longer. Even in summer, people here have no notion of going without fires in the evening. But then, though the days are very warm and sunny, the nights are always cold. For 7 months last summer, we had not one day that the sun did not shine as brilliantly as it does in England in the finest day in June, and though it has more power here, the heat is not nearly so oppressive. But then there is not the twilight which you get in England. Here it is light till about 8 o'clock, then in a few minutes it becomes too dark to see anything, and the change comes over in almost no time. The seasons are the reverse of those in England. Spring commences in September, summer in December, autumn in April, and winter in June. The days are an hour shorter at each end of the day in summer, and an hour longer in the winter than in England." In the flat Earth model of the cosmos, these Arctic and Antarctic phenomena are easily accounted for and exactly what would be expected. If the sun circles over and around the Earth every 24 hours, steadily traveling from tropic to tropic every 6 months, it follows that the northern, central region would annually receive far more heat and sunlight than the southern circumferential region. Since the sun must sweep over the larger southern region in the same 24 hours it has to pass over the smaller northern region, its passage must necessarily be proportionally faster as well. This is why the Antarctic morning dawn and evening twilight are very abrupt, whereas in extreme north, twilight continues for hours after sunset, and many midsummer nights the sun does not set at all. Dr. Samuel Rowbotham said, "If the sun is fixed and the earth revolves underneath it, the same phenomena would exist at the same distance on each side of the equator. But such is not the case. What can operate to cause the twilight in New Zealand to be so much more sudden, or the nights so much colder than in England? The southern hemisphere cannot revolve more rapidly than the northern. The latitudes are about the same, and the distance round a globe would be the same at 50 degrees south as at 50 degrees north, and as the whole would revolve once in 24 hours, the surface at the two places would pass underneath the sun with the same velocity, and the light would approach in the morning and recede in the evening in exactly the same manner. Yet the very contrary is the fact. The constant sunlight of the north develops, with the utmost rapidity, numerous forms of vegetable life, and furnishes subsistence for millions of living creatures. But in the south, where the sunlight never dwells, or lingers about a central region, but rapidly sweeps over sea and land, to complete in 24 hours the great circle of the southern circumference, it has not time to excite and stimulate the surface, and therefore, even in comparatively low southern latitudes, everything wears an aspect of desolation. These differences in the north and south could not exist if the earth were a globe, turning upon axes underneath a non-moving sun. The two hemispheres would at the same latitudes have the same degree of light and heat, and the same general phenomena, both in kind and degree. The peculiarities which are found in the south as compared with the north are only such as could exist upon a stationary plane, having a northern center, concentric with which is the path of the moving sun." And William Carpenter wrote, "Every year the sun is as long south of the equator as he is north, and if the earth were not stretched out as it is, in fact, but turned under, as the Newtonian theory suggests, it would certainly get as intensive a share of the sun's rays south as north. But the southern region being, in consequence of the fact stated, far more extensive than the region north, the sun, having to complete his journey round every 24 hours, travels quicker as he goes further south, from September to December, and his influence has less time in which to accumulate at any given point. Since then the facts could not be as they are if the Earth were a globe, it is a proof that the Earth is not a globe.
The midnight sun is a phenomenon experienced by observers north of the Arctic Circle during summer solstice, where the sun can be seen circling over and around 360 degrees without ever setting. Depending how far north the observer is, the sun can be seen for several days or weeks, rising and falling as usual, but never fully setting beyond the horizon. This is because the sun, having reached the Tropic of Cancer, is making its tightest, narrowest circle over the Earth, so much so that observers positioned centrally within the Arctic Circle are never at any time significantly far enough away from the sun for it to set beyond their horizon. Not until after summer solstice, when the sun makes its way back towards the equator, will the sun set completely and the Arctic days begin getting shorter. Meanwhile, in the Antarctic during summer solstice, the sun disappears completely for over 2 months, leaving everyone below the Antarctic Circle in bitter cold darkness from mid-May to mid-July. Again, this is because the sun, narrowing and tightening its path towards the Tropic of Cancer, means it has moved significantly far enough away from the Antarctic perimeter so as not to be seen by observers positioned so far south. Not until mid-July, when the sun expands and widens its path back significantly far enough, will Antarctic observers again be able to see the sun above the horizon and the Antarctic days begin getting longer. In order to fit the heliocentric globe model, this midnight sun phenomenon must also occur for observers south of the Antarctic Circle during winter solstice. Depending how far south the observer is, the sun should be seen for several days or weeks, never fully setting, just like it does in the north. In reality, however, there is never 24-hour sunlight anywhere in Antarctica at any time of year. During winter solstice, when the sun is circling its widest path over and around the Tropic of Capricorn, observers far enough south will experience extended daylight hours due to proximity with the sun, but will still observe it to rise and set beyond the horizon completely every single day. In fact, this is why the Arctic and Antarctic climates are so strikingly dissimilar, because of the drastically different amount of sunlight received by each. Based on the heliocentric globe model, both the Arctic and Antarctic receive comparable amounts of sunlight every year, and so should have comparable temperatures, seasonal changes, and ability to sustain plant and animal life, but in reality differ greatly in these ways. Antarctica is by far the coldest place on Earth, with an average annual temperature of approximately -57 degrees Fahrenheit, and a record low of -135.8. The average annual temperature at the North Pole, however, is a comparatively warm 4 degrees. Throughout the year, temperatures in the Antarctic vary less than half the amount at comparable Arctic latitudes. The northern Arctic region enjoys moderately warm summers and manageable winters, whereas the southern Antarctic region never even warms enough to melt the perpetual snow and ice. The island of Kerguelen, at 49 degrees southern latitude, has only 18 species of native plants that can survive its hostile climate. Compare this with the island of Iceland at 65 degrees northern latitude, 16 degrees further north of the equator than Kerguelen is south, yet Iceland is home to 870 species of native plants. On the Isle of Georgia, just 54 degrees southern latitude, the same latitude as Canada or England in the north, where dense forests of various tall trees abound, the infamous Captain Cook wrote that he was unable to find a single shrub large enough to make a toothpick. In the Arctic, there are 4 clearly distinguished seasons, warm summers, and an abundance of plant and animal life, none of which can be said of the Antarctic. The Eskimo live as far north as the 79th parallel, whereas in the south, no native man is found higher than the 56th. Since this one fact would destroy the heliocentric globe model, there is, and has been since the 1950s, an Antarctic treaty signed by over 50 countries banning all independent travel and exploration of the Antarctic. Excluding overpriced chaperoned penguin tours and government-approved contractors, nobody is allowed to step foot in Antarctica, especially not during winter solstice when there should supposedly be constant 24-hour sunlight. Since this particular lie is so important to the heliocentric facade, if you search online, you will find a couple videos purporting to show 24-hour sunlight in Antarctica, but just like the rest of the globe's pathetic video evidence, they are all fake. The most popular video allegedly showing an Antarctic 24-hour time-lapse actually has mountains accidentally layered over the video's text layer, proving it to be a calculated fraud. Other videos simply show an Arctic midnight sun time-lapse, but claim it to be from Antarctica. There are dozens of clearly genuine videos you can see online of the Arctic midnight sun, and you can freely travel above the Arctic Circle to experience it for yourself. Conversely, however, there are only a couple clearly fake videos online of the supposed Antarctic midnight sun, and you cannot ever freely travel there to experience it for yourself. Many people think that modern astronomy's ability to accurately predict lunar and solar eclipses is a result and proof positive of the heliocentric theory of the universe. The fact of the matter, however, is that eclipses have been accurately predicted by cultures worldwide for thousands of years before the heliocentric ball Earth was even a glimmer in Copernicus's imagination. Ptolemy, in the 1st century AD, accurately predicted eclipses for 600 years on the basis of a flat, stationary Earth with equal precision as anyone living today. All the way back in 600 BC, Thales accurately predicted an eclipse which ended the war between the Medes and the Lydians, and as far back as 3,000 years ago, the Chaldeans, Egyptians, Indians, Chinese, and others accurately predicted eclipses to within seconds of modern methods. Eclipses happen regularly, with precision, in 18-year cycles, so regardless of geocentric or heliocentric, flat or globe Earth cosmologies, eclipses can be accurately calculated independent of such factors. Another assumption and supposed proof of Earth's globular shape, heliocentrists claim that lunar eclipses are caused by the shadow of their ball Earth occulting the moon. The idea is that the Sun, Earth, and Moon's spheres perfectly align like 3 billiard balls in a row so that the Sun's light casts the Earth's shadow onto the Moon. Unfortunately for them, this explanation is rendered completely invalid due to the fact that lunar eclipses have happened and continue to happen regularly when both the Sun and Moon are still visible together above the horizon. But for the Sun's light to be casting Earth's shadow onto the Moon, the three bodies must be aligned in a straight 180-degree syzygy. As early as the time of Pliny, there are records of lunar eclipses happening while both the Sun and Moon are visible in the sky together, and it continues happening during lunar eclipses to this day. In an attempt to explain away the inconsistencies in their theory, heliocentrists usually claim light refraction must be happening on a scale large enough to account for the phenomena. But even if this highly implausible, reverse-engineered, damage control explanation is accepted, it cannot explain how Earthbound observers are supposedly able to see 12,000 miles, 180 degrees around a globular Earth to objects on the other side. The reality is, eclipses are a far more occult and mysterious phenomenon than lining up 3 billiard balls. Lunar eclipses only occur during full moons, when the moon is at the crossing point of the ecliptic opposite the sun, and solar eclipses only occur during new moons, when the moon is at the crossing point of the ecliptic and aligned with the sun. Such solar and lunar conjunctions and oppositions happen a minimum of 4 times per solar year, and depending on their exact altitudes and observer location, will produce partial, total, or annular eclipses. In ancient cosmology, these lunar nodes and accompanying eclipses were personified as the gods Rahu and Ketu, often shown devouring the sun or moon. During solar eclipses, the new moon conjunction directly crosses the sun, causing the blackout effect, and during lunar eclipses, the full moon opposition to the sun causes the shadowy red tint. This phenomenon is wholly celestial, involving the luminaries and their regular interactions with one another,
and not in any way terrestrial, involving the earth beneath our feet, causing upward casting shadows into the heavens.
Earth is a level, motionless plane with the sun, moon, and stars revolving over and around us just as you experience every day. The North Pole is the magnetic monopole center point, with Polaris, the North Pole star, situated directly above. Polaris is the only motionless star in the heavens, with all the other constellations revolving perfect circles over the Earth every night. The so-called planets, known to the ancients as wandering stars, were named such because they were observed then, as we can observe today, to wander the heavens, taking their own unique spirograph-like patterns, making both forward and retrograde motions over and around the Earth during their cycles. Meanwhile, the fixed stars were named such because they were observed then, as we can observe today, to stay fixed in their constellation patterns night after night, year after year, century after century, never changing their relative positions. If Earth was truly a tilting, wobbling, spinning space ball, as NASA and modern astronomy proclaim, rotating 1,000 miles per hour on its axis, revolving 67,000 miles per hour around the Sun, spiraling 500,000 miles per hour around the galaxy, and shooting off several million more miles per hour through the universe, the star patterns would never look the same 2 nights in a row, let alone be fixed in exactly the same constellations for thousands upon thousands of years. The reality is that the Earth and Polaris do not move, while everything else in the heavens revolves over Earth and around Polaris, east to west, like in a planetarium dome. Our Earth planetarium, however, is so vast that perspective won't allow any observer to see all the stars simultaneously from any one vantage point. We can see Polaris, Ursa Major and Minor, and other northern constellations from every point north of the equator simultaneously, but conversely cannot see the so-called South Pole star, Sigma Octantis, the Southern Cross, or other outer constellations simultaneously from every point south of the equator, because they all sweep over a great southern arc from their rise in the evening to their setting in the morning. Facing north, the stars turn counterclockwise from right to left. Facing south, they turn clockwise from left to right. Facing east, they rise in front and set behind, while facing west, they rise behind and set in front. So their apparent motion, angle, and inclination changes depending where you are on Earth and what direction you are facing. But their actual movement is always east to west. to learn much more about this most important and highly censored topic, please follow the links in the description box to my documentary, The History of Flat Earth, as well as my books, The Flat Earth Conspiracy and 200 Proofs Earth is Not a Spinning Ball. Thank you.